It's the My Michelle Live podcast.
My Michelle Live, Sci Tech Talk, taking the God story to a geeky place. Here's Michelle.
Welcome to Sci Tech Talk. Big things on the horizon today, as we are not afraid to ask some of those really tough questions. Today, I'm asking the question, how intelligent is design after all? I'm willing to ask the really hard questions of intelligent design. I mean, if we really want to walk by faith, what if that faith is on, I don't know, not so solid ground? What if what you believe really doesn't have a scientific base? Then it's just really blind faith, and it may not be real. So never be afraid to question what you think and question those beliefs. And we're going to do it with a man who has a way of gaining a lot of people's ire. But I have to say, one of the most amazing people to talk to. He's a biochemist, author, a professor of biochemistry, and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. And by the way, Wikipedia also adds this. He's an advocate for the pseudoscience principle of intelligent design. Welcome to our program, Michael Behe. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Michelle. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, you seem to elicit a lot of people's anger. And here's something I just want to ask right off the top. You get a lot of hard questions, and that's fine. Your latest book answers those. You're not afraid of those hard questions, but for some reason you draw people's ire. And I was thinking about this before I invited you on. I just wanted to point out there is a little bit of as people who are maybe more atheistic, Darwinian, evolutionists, a lot of them are great people and friends of mine, but sometimes there is a creepy factor to their stalking of those Christians. I mean, look, I don't believe in the tooth fairy, but I don't have websites, books, nor am I angry about the tooth fairy. Michael, I am not stalking kids with loose teeth and saying, okay, what's going to happen when that falls out, and looking under the pillows to see if their parents left a quarter. So what is it that bugs people about you?
Yeah, well, I think my big offense was to say that nature, you can look at nature and tell that it was designed, that it's a rational and empirical decision. It's not some hazy religious concept. You can know that nature is designed, and particularly life and the basis of life, molecular basis of life, simply by looking at how it's put together. Just like you would look at, say, a lawnmower and say, hey, that was not an accident, because I can see how all of the parts are fit together and fit to each other to accomplish some purpose. Same thing with the foundation of life. Back in Darwin's day, he didn't know what the foundation of life was like. Nobody knew back then. They thought that cells were like little pieces of jello. They called it protoplasm. And they didn't know that there were such things as molecules. People guessed that there might be such things, but they didn't know for sure. So we have made astounding progress since Darwin's day, but for some reason, biologists still feel stuck explaining things in that 19th century concept. But science has discovered that rather than a piece of jello, the cell, the very foundation of life, is built on machines, real machines made out of molecules. There are trucks, little molecular trucks and buses that kind of ferry passengers and cargo from one side of the cell to the other into the many different compartments of the cell. And there are outboard motors that can help a cell to swim. And there are chemical factories, and there is computer processing in the cell. Bill Gates has called DNA the most sophisticated computer program that he knows of. When we see a computer program, or we see a truck, or we see an outboard motor, we don't wonder whether they're products of chance and time. We know that they were designed, and it's a rational deduction because we see how all of the parts fit together to do the job. So same thing with the cell.
So as we look at that, it would be illogical and ridiculous to shut out any argument that says, wow, look at this design, what designed it? And that's really the basis of intelligent design. You look at the design of nature and say, wow, there looks to be some kind of intelligence behind it. You're basically looking at evidence. Now, what you do with the evidence, it leads to your faith. And that's something I just wanted to get out of the way at the beginning. You know, there are a lot of people that can look at the world around and say, what does the evidence say? I'm looking at an outboard motor. Evidence would say that someone created it. If it says Evinrude on it, that might even give us some specifics. I don't know, I'm not a genius or anything, and I don't have a scientific degree, but I'm just saying. But what we do with that, when you draw a conclusion saying, I believe that the evidence points to, for example, a biblical worldview, but there are other folks who may have no faith, may have no religious affiliation. It's just a matter of looking at the evidence. What you do with the evidence is kind of, well, if I might say, between you and God.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the really swell things about intelligent design is that it's pretty much independent of your philosophical or theological background. That if you came across, say, an outboard motor, if you, when I give talks, I like to show this wonderful Far Side cartoon. I love Far Side, and it shows
gives you a little insight into Michael's sense of humor.
Yeah.
Right?
And this shows a bunch of guys walking along a jungle path, and the lead one has been strung up by this vine, and there are these bamboo shoots that have come along and skewered him. And everybody can tell it was designed because you see all the parts fitting together. And as a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends on the viewer getting the design behind the trap. So and there's no philosophical, no theological implications to that. So the point is that when we see fantastically sophisticated machinery, then we always conclude design, and we conclude it based on our experience and our understanding of how minds work. Since we have minds ourselves, we can understand how minds work. And again, Darwin's theory was probably okay back in the day when he first proposed it, because not so much was known about life. But the more science has progressed, then the more and more and more confident we can be, because we now see the inner workings and the mechanisms and the sophistication of life, the more confident we can be of purposeful design.
So before we ask some of the hard questions, and that's some of what you take on in your book, do some of the roots of our cancel culture, or the idea of shutting down voices instead of debating them, I wonder if that mindset, in many cases, has its roots from the halls of science.
Well, I don't know. I'm not much of a sociologist or anything like that, but I know that people in general, especially when they're in charge, when they occupy the high ground of the culture, they like to keep control, and they like to squelch anything that seems to point out that they don't know what they're talking about. And whenever somebody's in a position of power, then the temptation is to try to shut down debate on something that might embarrass you. And I think that's a large part of what's going on in science here. That is that everybody agrees in the scientific community that Darwin's theory is correct. And if you look at the evidence, it's pretty much that agreement that's the only thing that is holding up Darwin's theory. And if people broke out of the pack and said, no, wait, show me some evidence that it works, then it would collapse in a heap. So
that's human nature, isn't it? I mean, it really is human nature. We've seen this again and again and again. When we have an steeped mindset, we get uncomfortable with any challenges. It's the brave people that say, well, what if? And I guess my concern is we're in a world that puts so much emphasis on science when science is one of those places that we shut out voices. I think it has a trickle down effect. I wanted to talk about your book, A Mousetrap for Darwin, where you answer some of your critics. But right off the bat, I have to ask this question. On the cover is a bacterial flagellum motor. Why is that on there? What's that about? That's not a mousetrap.
Well, yeah, but that's the kind of metaphorical mousetrap for Darwin. It's an example of the sophisticated machinery that's been discovered at the molecular foundation of life. It quite literally is an outboard motor that some bacteria use to swim, and it's got all sorts of parts that regular outboard motors would have. It's got a propeller, and it's got a motor and a drive shaft, and dozens of different parts. And the nice thing is that when you look at it, you can see that it is a machine. It's not like a machine. It is a real machine, and I like to use that image because it's I think it's most striking visual example of the argument for intelligent design.
Yeah, I would really encourage you as you're listening, if you're going to get the book. That's great. But even if you're not, oh my goodness, you really, really have to click on the link to see the cover of the book and look at this crazy picture. It really does look like some kind of piece of machinery, and when you realize that it's biological, it's really hard to say, yeah, that just happened from goo to you. It's pretty astounding. So if for no other reason, just click on the link just so you can see this picture.
That's a kind of the summary of the whole argument right there. That we say that was design, and Darwinists say, no, we can, our theory can account for that. And yes, you say, well, that's great.
How does their theory account for? Yeah, how does it account for that?
Well, it accounts for it by waving their hands quite a lot, changing the subject. I first wrote about that 25 years ago in a book called Darwin's Black Box, The Flagellum.
Yes.
And I said at that time, I looked through the scientific literature, and there had been no attempts even to explain how Darwinian processes could produce something like that. And 25 years later, there are still zero attempts at explaining that thing. So I think that's a pretty strong indication that Darwin's theory is just the wrong lens through which to view life.
And even if it were not, we should never be afraid to challenge our ideas or our theories. That's how we grow in knowledge. That's what science really is about. Some of the things that you take on in your book have to do with things that we have discovered in the last 100-some years that Darwinian evolution is having a hard time accounting for. So it's almost like, don't look at the guy behind the curtain. Don't look at this. Just pay attention to this thing that we're saying. And one of those things you address in a chapter in your book on the irreducibility of blood clotting blood clotting cascade.
Cascade. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. It's an example of something that doesn't impress you very much when you look at it from our everyday level. Guy goes in to shave in the morning, and you nick your neck, and a little bit of blood trickles out, and it slows down and stops and heals over. What's the big deal? But it turns out that the process that makes blood clot at the right time and the right place is enormously intricate and complex, with dozens of different parts. And if any of the parts are missing, you either bleed to death, or your blood clots all at once when it's not supposed to, and then you kind of get frozen in place. And either way, it's a big problem. So it turns out that it's not just the slowing down and the stopping of the blood. It's timing it, or having a clot in the right time and the right place. Because if it clots in the wrong time, you might have, or wrong place, you might have a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. So even something as that on the surface looks as simple as blood clotting turns out to be enormously complex. And that's just an example of many different things in life.
Will the truth
And
set
that's
you free?
something that
Maybe.
we can consider irreducible. In other words, you can't just trial and error that because you would bleed to death in the process. I mean, is that a simple way of saying it?
That's right. It's called a cascade because one factor, there's this component that forms the clot. But if it was the only one that was there, all your blood would be clotted, and that would not be good. So there's another component which acts on a precursor to that protein that forms the clot. But if that was present and in the active form, it would activate all of the clot material, and you'd be in the same bad shape as before. So there's all this convoluted control system, and again, if one of the factors that are necessary is missing, it either sets off the whole thing at once, or it doesn't get set off even when it's supposed to be. So, yeah, it's irreducible in the sense that you can't take a factor away and still have it work.
Okay, so talking about taking factors away, somewhere along the line, if we crawled out of the ooze, we would have had to have, our gills would have had to have fallen off, and as would our webbed feet and all of that. And so we think of some of the throwaway functions in the last, years of science. We've seen that things like when I was a kid, Michael, everyone was getting their tonsils out because they were just this useless thing left over from evolution, right? And you would get tonsillitis. So to prevent that, everyone got their tonsils out. My mom would not let me get my tonsils out. She said, God put them there for a reason. We're going to leave them in. And I hated that. Everyone got to stay home from school and eat freaking ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Are you kidding me? Every kid wanted their tonsils out. And then turns out as an adult, we find out tonsils really do have a purpose. Ouch. And so that leads me to something that there has to be a net benefit for these throwaway functions. Otherwise, we have to get rid of them, but there has to be a benefit in getting rid of them, and we don't see that in Darwinian evolution.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. Well, I'm one of the guys who did, in fact, have my tonsils out when I was in first grade, I think, and and I got ice cream, but I tell you what, I'd trade the ice cream and keep my tonsils. Yeah, that's one of the things that Darwinists do is when they see an organ or some feature that they don't know what the heck it does, they say, it's just some useless leftover because we know evolution doesn't care about perfection or anything. And that's what is classically called an argument from ignorance. and that is that I don't know what this does, therefore it doesn't do anything. And that argument has a very, very bad track record in biology and life.
That's as bad as coming to the idea that the sun rises in the sky because it's some god staring down at us, or it's along the lines of superstition. We think we're so advanced, and yet we're thinking that way. That's creepy to me.
Yeah. Well, even scientists are people too. So we all make the same mistakes of wishful thinking and prejudice for our own conclusions and so on. But that's still active. There's something called junk DNA. A couple decades ago, somebody said, well, there's all this DNA, and a large chunk of it we don't know what it does in the human genome. So therefore, it probably does nothing, and therefore it's junk. And that idea got a lot of play for a while until it was all sorts of functions, all sorts of useful things were discovered within what was thought to be junk. And so that concept is pretty much gone now, but you can bet your bottom dollar. And next thing, somebody focuses on that nobody knows what it does. That Darwinists will say that it's probably just useless junk.
Okay, so up till now, I've thrown you some softballs, which was kind of nice. We're kind of getting warmed up. But honestly, ideas and theories really mean nothing unless we're willing to take on the hard questions. I wanted to ask you what some of the most challenging questions that you've been posed, and you've had a lot. You could just Google Michael Behe, and you'll see that people have. Well, he says this, and there's. So I want to know what you had to really dig deep and say. You know what? That is kind of a conundrum.
Well, I really, hate to say this, and I really wish I could, agree, but I haven't run across anything that has made me think twice about my conclusion. I think that the conclusion of design, when you see and understand the foundation of life, is just one big, duh. It's so easy to see, but
That's hard to say, but you know what? I have to agree with you. Now, I'm not a scientist, but where some of the quote hard questions of faith come into consideration, I look at it and go, that's not so tough. Or how, in my worldview, my conclusion when I look at scientific evidence is that it adheres to a biblical worldview. That's my conclusion based on the evidence. And I have not seen, though people say there's contradictions and there's this. I haven't run up against anything where I don't have a problem with saying, oh yeah, that's tough. I don't know. And the body of evidence would still lead me to conclude, but I haven't come to that either. Maybe we just need people to ask harder questions, but that's where I'm at as well. But I would like for you to share with us some of the questions that people have posed that they really think they've given you an gotcha.
Well, let's see. Most of the responses to intelligent design are things like well, give us another 20 years and we'll figure out how evolution made the bacterial flagellum or something.
Okay, fine. That's fine. Go ahead. We can take 20 years to do that. But in the meantime, why not at least be looking into what this intelligent design might be and who, if we can find fingerprints of the designer like Evinrude on the outboard motor.
Exactly, and the ironic thing is that it's been 25 years since I first wrote about the flagellum, and there's still no progress on the Darwinian front. And there's another objection is that you can't make these irreducibly complex systems directly. Say you couldn't build an outboard motor or even a mousetrap piece by piece and have it work and each piece improve things. But maybe maybe it wasn't a mousetrap all the time. Maybe it was a doorstop, and then changed into a key holder, and changed back and forth, and finally ended up as, say, a mousetrap. And you say, well, show me that in a little bit more detail. How could it do that? And without exception, it's just a just so story where they can't show that there are intermediates, whether or not there were on the direct route to whatever system you're thinking about, or whether they're indirect. And so that's another favorite. And one more is simply to misrepresent what I say, to misrepresent what I mean by irreducible complexity, to not read my rebuttals and then pretend that I had not answered, or that I was so taken with criticism that I retired into a monastery and never never came out again. But that's what this new book is supposed to counter, at least, and that is to gather together all of my responses to criticisms over decades, just so people can't ignore them anymore. And next time some criticism comes up, I at least will be able to point to the exact place, easily accessible, where folks can see my responses for themselves.
To me, Michael, that is one of the most powerful reasons to pick up this book. For those who are not afraid to challenge their own theories, if you think you're right, then don't be afraid of the challenge, because the truth will set you free, my friend. For those who may be of the ID mindset, and we're faced with a daily onslaught of people saying, well, you're crazy and you're anti-science, and by the way, didn't I see you entering a church? Ooh, see, and so having someone who this is part of your life's work answering those critics, this gives you some insight on how you might be able to do that as well. Be informed. So some great reasons to pick up the book. Do you have time for just a couple other quick questions that I just
Yeah,
find
sure.
really interesting? One of the big conversations through science right now is the Wolfram idea. It's a theory of everything. It's a Wolfram Physics project. It's
Sure.
something that people have talked about, and you actually address it in your book.
Yeah, that's right. Stephen Wolfram. He was this child genius, and he grew up to be an adult genius. Not everybody does. And he's rich, and he wrote a program called Mathematica, which engineers and scientists use to do higher math. And he espouses a theory that, well, there's all sorts of complexity in the world, and if the complex systems kind of bounce around in the right way, then they can form interesting patterns. For example, he has a number of little programs where the program is told to color in a square in this kind of a crossword puzzle grid, and then follow some rules about whether to color in another square. And with the right rules, you can get these neat patterns unfolding. You can get triangles, or you could get things that look like birds, or things that seem to be moving in the pattern, and so on. And it's all very interesting. And there are other folks who advocate sort of kind of similar things. But when you try to say, what does this have to do with biology? It gets real hazy, real fast. So these are nice. He's a mathematician, and for all I know, it might be a lot of very interesting mathematics, but nobody has made a connection to biology. And if you look at biological evolution experiments, or patterns in various data from life, you don't see anything like what these folks are talking about. So again, Stephen Wolfram and other folks, they might have an interesting concept in computer science or mathematics, but it doesn't seem to relate at all to evolution or life.
Well, as we look at random, random in nature really turns out to not be random. Haven't we figured that out in recent scientific discovery?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define random, which is real tough. Computer folks and physicists and stuff depend on random events in some theories. But yeah, you can never actually prove that something is random. You can just kind of test to see if it looks to be random as far as we know. I was going to say that in evolution, of course, in Darwin's theory, it depends heavily on random mutation and then natural selection. But again, who can tell if something is random unless you have some independent knowledge, some complex pattern that you don't know about could underlie a lot of things that are going on. So essentially, people assume that mutation is random, but it might not be.
And in order to try to look at something random, you need complex. I mean, even Wolfram has complex mathematics in order to come up with these theories. And you're going, well, okay, if there is even math, then there is order, even to your random theories. So that's where it's hard for me to wrap my head around. Are there any powerful arguments for Darwinian evolution that are still out there?
No. But here are the ones that people usually point to. Many people confuse evidence for what I would call mere evolution, yes, with Darwinism. And by mere, to play on Mere Christianity, of course, by C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book about, the many things that different Christian churches have in common. Well, mere evolution would be the idea of common descent. That is, that organisms alive today descended somehow from organisms in the misty past, but it doesn't say how such fantastic changes could have occurred. But Darwin's theory, his claim to fame wasn't evolution per se, wasn't mere evolution. A number of naturalists had proposed it before him. His claim to fame was the proposal that random variations, when it's filtered by natural selection, could drive and build all of the complex and elegant features that we see in life today. And that is the critical question, both scientific and I think philosophical question. It's not common sense, because common sense says, well, you had an organism in the past that had these features, and now we have a descendant, and it has the same features and some different ones. But it doesn't say where the ancestor came from. It doesn't say how the modern form came to differ. It just says that it was there, and hey, look, it's still here. So that's kind of trivial. But Darwin's theory says that, hey, we got that covered. We can tell you where the new features came from. But it turns out they can't. They just assume it. After Darwin's idea came along and was accepted, people assumed that it was responsible. And it turns out
That's lazy science. That's lazy science right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, not only yeah, was lazy, but it's also true that we didn't have the tools to really test his theory until recently, because now we know that these random variations that Darwin talked about are actually due to mutations, which are changes in molecules, and he knew nothing about molecules. And they're actually changes in DNA, in the sequence of nucleotides in DNA. So in order to see what Darwin's mechanism can do, you have to be able to find those changes at the molecular level in large numbers of organisms for large numbers of generations. And it turns out that it's only been the past 10, 20 years that to be able to track those down. And it turns out, as I've written in my book before this, when Darwin evolves, that that mutations do occur, and sometimes they help, and natural selection allows them to increase in the population. But
I was born for one
for the
purpose,
very large part, they're
to bear
generally
witness to the
mutations
truth.
that
All who can
break
accept the
or
truth hear my
damage
voice.
genes
And
that
what
were already there.
is
They're
The
essentially
truth.
throwing genetic information overboard for short-term gain. So Darwin's theory has actually
Reality.
been
We're going to look
the evidence has
technology
come strongly
that
against
kind
it
of,
now that we
well,
can actually
fakes
test
you
it at
out.
the
It's
molecular
time for
level.
King's Equity. All of this has been so interesting, and we've even taken more time than I promised, and I apologize for that. But I mean, this is something that you can talk about all day. There are so many areas. You could dissect our human bodies from our fingernails,
Today
our
on
eyeballs,
SciTech
blood
Talk,
clotting,
talking about
to
truth.
my
What
response to
is
COVID,
truth?
right?
And
All of these things
today
are
on
so amazing. And just taking a walk through nature, the beauty, the diversity, it's astounding. And so I wanted to end our interview all kind of where we began with
today on
your
SciTech
stalkers.
Talk,
I
talking
call them
about
that.
truth.
Because
What
you
is
really do
truth?
have
And
folks who are, if what you believe is so outlandish, then leave it alone. It should disprove itself. But for some reason, it truly bothers people. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's just because
will the
of
truth set you
the
free?
science
Maybe
that they
if you
feel
can figure out
uncomfortable with,
what
as you mentioned, that you get your mindset on something and someone challenges you. It's human nature to have your like a rooster have your hackles up. Or if it's because maybe you draw a conclusion in your personal life as to what all of this means. I'd like your
Well,
thoughts.
yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, nobody would care about bacterial flagella or blood clotting
truth and
if
I was born for one.
if it didn't point to higher conclusions. And a lot of folks really think that are very comfortable with their worldview of nature being self-sufficient. And if one points out that, well,
I was born for one
doesn't seem
purpose.
to be the correct interpretation,
will the truth set you free?
they can get
Maybe
really,
you can
really
figure out what it
defensive,
is.
and more than
Dealing
defensive, then
with
they
truth
can
and
get
finding
offensive
what really
too.
is truth and dealing
Yeah, nobody would care, about nobody cares about 99% of scientific results unless they, result in a new iPhone or something. They only care about the argument for intelligent design. They only care about the irreducibility of biochemical systems because it points to a designer, and that can have very profound implications for how we conduct our lives.
Because you have to look at the evidence, and in some way you do have to draw a conclusion. I mean, that's the logical outpouring. So in that, that's where science is important. And it's important if you're on the other side of ID. We can, if you believe in a creationism, if you believe in intelligent design, we can get just as offensive and offended at a challenge too. That's part of human nature. So, maybe the challenge for our society, in my opinion, Michael, in this cancel culture world we live in, is to be willing to listen, whatever the ideas are, talk it out, debate it out, and shake hands at the end of the day. But it's important to come to your own conclusion based on the evidence. What do you say? And we always get to the God story on this program. Michael, oh, it's so good to talk with you. I always love our conversations. And can I just give you a little bit of praise? One thing that you do that you're so gifted at is taking ideas in science and making them
Mainstream
palatable
media
for
is operating in a
a
propaganda
fast
rich
food
environment.
generation.
There is an invasion of
You give us,
deception on
you
one
give us, it's Chateaubriand in a way that we can all pronounce, and I really appreciate you making science attainable for the rest of us.
Well, thanks very much for saying that. It's a lot of fun. I have a good time doing all of this.
Last question is, what's coming up on the horizons for Michael Behe?
Well, right now I'm just talking about my two books that have come out within the past couple of years, but I have another book in mind, but it'll probably be at least 5 years down the road, talking about how we perceive the work of a mind. How can we be sure that that a mind is behind some deed or some work in our world, because it yeah, so it's going to be a little, it's going to be science and philosophy and maybe a bit of theology and so on. But
what does that say about me? I must be some sort of geek because you're talking about. I'm getting goosebumps going. Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm jazzed. It's like I get the same feeling when I watch the Seahawks win, which didn't really happen this last season. So I have to have something to get excited about.
Yeah, well, I don't share that though. For me, it's the Eagles. It's the Eagles for me.
Okay. Well, your Eagles
Yeah.
aren't in the Super Bowl either, Michael.
Yeah.
So
No,
we'll just
yeah.
commiserate together and get excited about science and your book, A Mousetrap for
Yeah.
Darwin. Michael
Okay.
J. Behe answers his critics. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Michelle. Bye-bye.
More SciTech Talk at mymichellelive.com.